Hello, I'm Sister Abigail. This is the Sister Abigail Show, and we're continuing our series on the Bible and homosexuality that was graciously given to us to share on our program by Pastor Chuck Breckenridge of Diversity Christian Fellowship. On today's show, he's going to discuss another one of the text of terror. He's going to talk about another one of those clobber passages that's found in the Epistle of Jude. So stay tuned.
So let's talk about Jude, because we're going through this really fast so we can get this all on tape real good. There's so much in Scripture to go through, though. There's no way we would be able to touch on everything in such a quick study. Jude's comments kind of go along and connect very well with what Paul's writing about. If I can find my book here. And Jude verse 7 is typically where we have the biggest, people want to use it against. It says, in a similar way, Sodom and Gomorrah and their surrounding towns gave themselves over to sexual immorality and perversion. They serve as an example of those who suffer the punishment of eternal fire. Now, if you back up and read the story, and you'll see that just like, and as a matter of fact, if you go through and you search out all the references to Sodom and Gomorrah throughout Scripture, exclusively, every time you find references to that, it is in reference to idolatry. God comparing what Sodom did to an idolatrous event occurring at the same time in Jerusalem or in Israel. If you go through and you look it up, you'll find every time that's what happens. And there's no exception here. Let's back up. Let's back up to verse 5. It says, though you already know all this, I want to remind you that the Lord delivered his people out of Egypt, but later destroyed those who did not believe. And the angels who did not keep their positions of authority, but abandoned their own home, these he has kept in darkness, bound with everlasting chains for the judgment on the great day. In a similar way, Sodom and Gomorrah and the surrounding towns gave themselves over to sexual immorality and perversion. They served as an example to those who suffer the punishment of eternal fire. Now, if you look in the King James, I believe is what it is, the King James word. Anybody happen to have a King James Bible with you? Surely we have a King James Bible around here somewhere. Do we? Read verse 7 out of the King James. I think that's of Jude. Mm-hmm. So I don't like the way the NIV loses the translation there. Yeah, verse 7. Okay, so the King James says that they gave themselves over to sexual immorality and went after strange flesh. Now, the traditional community wants to take that and wants to say, well, it's because they went after homosexual acts. Now, if you study that, if you look at it, first of all, if you look at what he's talking about in the entire thing, he's really talking about these angelic beings that sinned. He even talks, if you go back and you read he's talking about the angels that did not keep their positions of authority. And in the same paragraph, he goes on and says, in a similar way, when Sodom and Gomorrah and the surrounding cities gave themselves over to sexual immorality and went after strange flesh. Now, the conservatives and modern day teachers want to say that, well, that means that because they went after the men of the city went after what was unnatural and went after these other men, but that is not what he says in the Greek. The Greek he says that they went after. A while ago we said sarx, S-A-R-X is flesh. He said the Greek says that they went after heteros sarx. They went after strange flesh. It could also mean different flesh. And what we know today would be opposite. But he says that he didn't say that they went after the same flesh. Had he been saying it was because of a homosexual act, Jude should have said they went after homosarchs. They went after the same flesh. These men went after other men. That's not what he says. He's referring to the nature of the angelic beings that they wanted to violate. He says they went after heterosarchs. They went after a flesh. They went after something that was different than who they were. So he's not talking about a homosexual act here. He's talking about these angelic beings, and the whole book of what he's writing about is involved with these fallen angels, and that how these angels came to Sodom and Gomorrah, and that the men of Sodom and Gomorrah wanted to violate them and wanted to have this violence against them. The NIV calls it perversion, and that is not an accurate translation because it goes beyond perversion, because it wasn't simply because of what they were men. It was because they were angelic beings. And Jude, along with most of the Jewish traditions, teach that the men of Sodom and Gomorrah knew that the angels that have come to the city were angels, that they recognized them as angels, and it was because of their divine nature was why they were wanting to have sex with them. Now, whether that's true or not, I don't know. There's not really anything in the book of Genesis that really gives me any indication that makes me think that the people of Sodom and Gomorrah recognized that they were divine beings. But Jude's writings and some of the other writings of that day do keep that tradition that was why they wanted to do that. And looking at with that tradition, you would understand why Jude would be writing about these fallen angels and why he would be writing that they wanted to go after these angelic beings because they knew they were angels. And so he uses the term heterosarchs. They went after strange flesh, not homosarchs. Let me pause here for a few minutes. Any questions on what we went through before we get too far? Is everybody on board? It was very common in idolatrous practices of that day. Was very, very common. So much so that they had a word for the people that worked there. You know, the Quadesh. You know that it was. We have words today for people like that, but we don't really connect with that type of a mentality because in the world we live in, that is really even now not a very common. Oh, thank you so very much. That is really not a very common thing, you know, and modern worship, even amongst other religions, we would consider anybody that we found out, the church they go to, they have big orgies, after service. We would be going, sounds like a cult. We would recognize that as being an inappropriate worship. In modern civilization, we've kind of realized that. But you have to remember, this is back thousands of years ago when it was very common. Very, very common that was part of idolatry. I mean, this is a time when people literally would take their children and put them on this bronze statue's arms to burn them alive. It's a time that, the sex in the temple was probably one of the least barbaric things. And it was very extremely common, prostitution, even in the days of Rome. When Paul is writing these things, when he talks in Corinthians about, though I have speak in the tongues of angels and have not love, I'm as sounding brass or as clanging cymbals. And he's referring to the temple prostitutes that would wander through the city with their little cymbals and their little things and their little bells on their garments, announcing the temple being open for people to come and to worship and to come and basically to come have sex. It was basic. That's basically what some of those temples were. They called it worship, but it was pretty much just a brothel. A religious brothel is what it was, and that was very common back in those days. We don't equate that, and so we kind of modern day we don't see that when we read it because we're not as familiar with that day. Back in that day when it was being writing, if they'd have said the Quadesh, talking about the little sacred man that works down the temple as a prostitute, everybody would have known what they were talking about. Very common. He was probably a respected man because the idols, it was temple. It was sacred things, and they were treated as such. So it wasn't looked upon as probably the way we look upon things now, and so it was a totally different culture and concept than what we have. And so when we read these things, we look at them, we immediately, and that's why people today have such a hard time accepting some of the teachings as being so much different, because they read it and they go, oh, well, it's got to be because they were gay, and they don't think about the other things that were going on in the bigger picture. Yes. Adulterers being stoned. Yeah, there's not any references in that we have historically of someone being killed or being brought, whatever penalty being brought on someone for being gay. Not in Scripture, at least, and historically there may be something that I'm not aware of, but. And especially if it was as huge a sin as the world wants to teach that it is, you think that God would have been a little more clearer on the topic. If it's really what the world wants to call the abomination, that God, that it's an abomination to God, you think that God would have been a little bit more specific on, but what God, and when a word is used, abomination and detestable, it's always idolatry. That is what gets God. When God gets upset about something, it's idolatry. You go and look at Jerusalem and through Israel's history. When did they get into trouble? When they started worshiping idols. That's when God brought judgment upon them. They would start doing idol worship again and get back into that, and then God would have to bring judgment upon them because He won't allow it.
Well, we've completed our series, at least part of the series, talking about the text of terror, but in our upcoming series, we're going to be talking about scriptures of affirmation for GLBT Christians. Scriptures that include people such as Ruth and Naomi, David and Jonathan. What did Jesus actually say on the topic of homosexuality? Well, be sure to stay tuned for the next 3 or 4 shows, and thanks so much for listening.